It was past midnight when Chris and I left the old 24-hour diner at the edge of town. We had spent the evening catching up over burgers and coffee, talking about high school memories and future plans that would likely never materialize. As we strolled toward my car parked a little further down the block, Chris slowed his pace. I glanced over and noticed him rubbing his temples. He was pale. "Everything okay, man?" I asked, half-jokingly. "Too much greasy diner food?" Chris shook his head, wincing as he leaned against a nearby lamppost. "No, it's different," he mumbled. "Everything's spinning." He grimaced, clutching his stomach as he swayed on his feet. I rushed over and grabbed him by the arm just as his legs gave out. His breathing was ragged, each breath shallow and strained. A jolt of panic shot through me. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it was more than just a bad burger. "Come on," I said, guiding him toward the car. "We need to get you to the hospital." We barely made it to the passenger seat before he collapsed completely. I managed to push him inside, buckling his seatbelt as his head lolled against the window. His breathing had grown faint, his skin cold. I didn't waste any more time. I jumped into the driver's seat and sped toward the hospital. The roads were empty, the entire town blanketed in a pale bluish light that made everything look strangely surreal. When the hospital finally came into view, I pulled up to the emergency entrance and skidded to a stop. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I half-dragged, half-carried Chris inside. The bright fluorescent lights inside the emergency room burned my eyes as I shouted for help. A nurse and a security guard rushed over immediately. Chris was placed on a gurney and whisked away into a triage room. I tried to follow, but the nurse held up a hand. "You need to stay in the waiting room, sir. Someone will come speak to you soon." Reluctantly, I turned back and made my way into the waiting room. It was a small, uninviting space lined with rows of faded plastic chairs. The harsh lighting overhead buzzed like a hive of angry bees, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, with a hint of something stale like old coffee or cheap hospital food. The reception desk sat at the far end of the room, cluttered with stacks of paperwork and a dusty computer monitor. Behind the desk, a tired-looking receptionist typed away with little enthusiasm, barely glancing up as I entered. She looked like she had been working the night shift for years, with deep shadows under her eyes and a weary slump in her posture. A glass partition separated her from the waiting area, with a small sliding window used to speak to patients. Aside from the receptionist, there were only a few other people scattered around the room. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled jacket sat slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the floor tiles, his face pale and drawn. Across from him, a young woman scrolled through her phone, her foot tapping rhythmically against the leg of the chair. In the far corner, an elderly woman with a hunched back knitted quietly, her lips moving as she murmured to herself, though I couldn't make out the words. The wall-mounted TV flickered above, showing a muted news broadcast with closed captions, scrolling across the screen. Next to it, a clock ticked irregularly, the second hand jerking with each movement as though struggling to keep time. The room itself seemed caught in some liminal state. I chose a seat near the corner, trying to calm my breathing. My heart was still racing from the rush to the hospital. The seat beneath me was stiff and uncomfortable, offering little relief from the tension gripping my body. I shifted, trying to find a better position, when I felt something crinkle under my leg. Frowning, I reached down and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that had been wedged into the chair. It was old and yellowed at the edges, like it had been left there for a while. Curious, I unfolded the paper and smoothed it out on my lap. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry or panicked. The list was numbered, and as I began to read, I couldn't help but feel a mix of surprise and amusement at what was written there. Rule 1. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. I raised an eyebrow. That seemed oddly specific. Why would anyone write something like that? I glanced over at the receptionist, who was still tapping away at her keyboard, oblivious to the rest of the room. Was this some kind of prank? The idea made me smirk a little despite the heaviness in the air. Rule 2. Never walk past the reception desk without greeting the receptionist after 2:30 a.m. I let out a short, dry laugh. So I'm supposed to be polite now? I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. It was all so ridiculous. Maybe someone had written this as a joke to mess with the people stuck here at odd hours, bored out of their minds. I could imagine some bored night shifter scribbling out these rules as a way to pass the time. Rule 3. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. I paused. That one was strange. It carried a different weight compared to the others. Who wouldn't help someone lost in a hospital of all places? Rule 4. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. The amusement drained from my expression. I felt a chill run up my spine, as if the temperature in the room had just dropped a few degrees. I glanced toward the dimly lit hallway that led to the ER rooms. It seemed to stretch into darkness. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. This list was just some random nonsense, wasn't it? I continued reading, my curiosity now tinged with unease. Rule 5. If a power outage occurs, stay seated and do not move. Rule 6. If a door that should be locked is found open, close it immediately and do not look inside. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I couldn't explain why, but each rule seemed to grow darker, more foreboding as I read on. It wasn't just the content of the rules, it was the way they were written, as if someone were trying to warn me. Rule 7. Do not look through the glass doors leading to the courtyard after 4 a.m. Rule 8. If you feel a sudden chill, do not look over your shoulder. That one made me swallow hard. There was something inherently unsettling about the thought of a chill creeping up on you from behind and not being able to turn around to see what or who might be there. I couldn't help but glance behind me, but there was nothing there. Just the same sterile room with its faded chairs and buzzing lights. I reached the last rule, and for some reason, my heart beat a little faster. Rule 9. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. It's safe to leave after 6:40 a.m. My gaze flicked up to the wall-mounted clock, its second hand twitching with every tick. It read 1:30 a.m. At the bottom of the paper, written in shaky red ink, were the words, "Trust me, I learned the hard way." There was a dark, crusted stain on the corner, one that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I rubbed my fingers over the words, feeling the rough texture of the ink beneath my skin. I couldn't help but let out a short, nervous laugh. What kind of place is this? I whispered to myself. I slumped back in the chair. It was hard to shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but I forced myself to dismiss it as a weird prank. The list couldn't actually mean anything, just someone's twisted idea of a joke. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts. A part of me couldn't stop thinking about Chris and the way he had collapsed in the parking lot. The quiet hum of the waiting room wrapped itself around me, making the place feel even more isolating. That's when I heard it. My name. Spoken. In a low, barely audible voice that seemed to drift down the hallway. Adam. Adam. My eyes shot open, and my body tensed. The voice was unmistakable. It was Chris. I jerked my head towards the corridor leading to the ER rooms, but there was no one in sight, just the pale overhead lights flickering. The voice came again, a little louder this time. Adam, help me. I jumped up from the chair, the sound of my name sending shivers down my spine. My feet were already moving before I realized it. I took a few steps into the hallway. I glanced. Back at the waiting area now a few steps behind me, the other visitors still scattered about seemed completely unaware, oblivious to the voice echoing down the hall. Adam, Chris's voice was more desperate now, laced with pain. I took another step down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the floor. As I walked deeper into the corridor, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed louder, some of them flickering. out completely, leaving long stretches of darkness. The ER rooms lined the sides of the hallway, their doors slightly ajar. I hesitated as I reached one of the open doorways. I peered inside and immediately wished I hadn't. There, standing in the center of the dimly lit room, was a man in a patient's gown facing me. The man's head moved in quick, jerking motions, shaking from side to side so rapidly that I couldn't make out any details. It was just a blur, a sickening blur. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and I stumbled, back in shock. My breathing grew shallow as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen, but there was no time to process it. Chris's voice came again, further down the hallway. "Adam, please." I pushed forward, forcing myself to continue. The unsettling darkness around me seemed to press in from all sides. I came across another room, the door half open. Inside, I could see a doctor standing over a patient, his back hunched as he examined something on the table. The doctor wore a white lab coat and surgical mask, his features obscured. But there was something off about the way he moved. His motions were robotic. Then I noticed the tool in his hand, a bone saw. He raised it slowly, the harsh metal glinting under the dim light, and then I heard a gut-wrenching scream from the patient on the table. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall behind me, my eyes wide with terror. When I looked back into the room, it was empty. There was no doctor, no patient, just a dark, vacant space. My hands trembled as I rubbed my face, trying to snap out of whatever hallucination I was trapped in. "This can't be real," I whispered, to myself. But the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, and Chris's voice continued to call out, drawing me further in. As I turned the next corner, I froze. There, hanging in the doorway of a nearby room, was a mass of dark hair, long and tangled, spilling down from just beyond the doorframe. It looked like someone was standing behind the door, peeking around the corner. A single eye, black as pitch, stared directly at me from the darkness. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The figure remained there, still and silent, just watching me. I took a slow step forward, and then the eye pulled back into the shadows, disappearing from view. The hallway was deathly quiet, save for the low hum of the lights. I forced myself to move past the doorway, my pulse hammering in my ears. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure again, just around the corner of the room, her head unnaturally high, as if she were crouched against the ceiling. I could see more of her this time. Her elongated arm stretched out, the bony hand reaching towards me. Before I could react, the hand brushed my shoulder, cold and corpse-stiff. Its fingers scratched into my skin like claws. I bolted, my shoes, squeaking on the linoleum as I raced down the hallway. I had no idea where I was going. I just wanted to get away from whatever that thing was. I threw open the first door I saw and stumbled back into the waiting room. My heart pounded in my chest as I staggered to a stop. Everything appeared normal again. The reception desk, the plastic chairs, the other visitors who hadn't moved an inch. It was as if none of it had happened. But my skin prickled with the lingering touch of that hand. Glancing at my shoulder, I noticed 3 faded scratch marks, a reminder that something was very, very wrong. I slumped back into a chair, catching my breath, trying to make sense of the nightmare I had just experienced. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled list of rules, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. I glanced at Rule 4 again, the words seeming to taunt me. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. I had ignored it, and now I was starting to believe that those rules weren't a joke after all. I tried to calm myself, my breathing coming in short, ragged gasps as I leaned back in the chair. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to force myself to think rationally. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived, or maybe the stress of seeing Chris collapse was catching up to me. I told myself that I had only imagined the things I saw in the hallway. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the feeling of that cold hand brushing against my skin lingered. I glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m. The minutes seemed to crawl by. I couldn't shake the dread that had settled in my chest. My thoughts drifted back to the list of rules. Each one seemed ridiculous on its own, but after my experience in the hallway, I found myself paying closer attention to each word. That was when I noticed him, a man who hadn't been in the room before. He stood near the entrance, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his long coat, his eyes scanning the waiting room like he was searching for someone. His presence sent a jolt of unease through me. I was sure he hadn't been there earlier. I would have remembered his tall, lanky figure and the unsettling way his gaze seemed to linger on the other visitors, one by one. The list. I pulled it from my pocket and read the third rule again. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. The man's gaze found me, and he started walking toward where I sat. My body stiffened, every muscle tensing involuntarily. There was no mistaking his intention. He stopped a few feet away, leaning slightly forward, as though inspecting me. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that was calm but too deliberate. "Could you help me find the ICU? I seem to be a little lost." The tone of his voice was polite enough, but there was something off about it, something that put me on edge. It was as though he was trying to mimic normal speech but wasn't quite getting it right. I glanced around the waiting room, but no one else seemed to notice the man's presence. The receptionist didn't even look up. I shook my head, gripping the list tighter in my hand. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," I stammered. The man didn't move. He just kept staring at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice growing softer, almost coaxing. "It won't take but a moment. It's just down the hall, right?" I didn't know what to say. A part of me felt guilty for not helping him. But the words on the list kept flashing in my mind. Do not help them. I forced myself to look away, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But instead, he took a step closer. "It's not very kind to ignore someone who needs help," he said, his tone now edged with something darker. I glanced at his face, and for a split second, his features seemed to shift. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, the kind that didn't belong on a human face. The corners of his lips seemed to extend too far, the teeth behind them, slightly jagged. I shot up from my chair, stumbling backward. The man's smile didn't waver as he turned his head slightly, like he was examining me from a different angle. Then he turned towards the reception desk and started walking, slowly and unnatural. At one point, his head snapped towards me unnaturally, the same grin on his face as he continued walking. I froze. I couldn't look away. Then, as he reached the reception desk, he just passed through it, and then he suddenly disappeared. My gaze darted around the waiting room. The other visitors were still exactly where they had been moments ago, their expressions unchanged, their movements as mechanical as before. I glanced back at the receptionist. She was still at her desk, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the computer screen. My gaze flickered up to the clock on the wall. It was 1:58 a.m., and Rule 1 flashed in my mind. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. After a few minutes, I glanced toward her, my eyes drifting out of habit. It was just for a second. The receptionist was staring straight at me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. She wasn't moving. It was as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I tore my gaze away, my pulse quickening. As I turned, my head out of the corner of my eye, I noticed her get up from her chair, her movements oddly stiff, as though her joints didn't bend the right way. She walked forward, but not around the reception desk. She passed through it, like it wasn't even there. I froze, not daring to look directly at her again. I squeezed my eyes shut. I felt the air grow colder, the chill pressing against my skin. It felt as if she were getting closer. I could hear the faintest rustle of fabric, the light creak of footsteps on the floor, growing louder with each passing second. "Don't look. Just don't look," I told myself, my hands gripping the edges of the chair. I sat there, tense and unmoving, my eyes squeezed shut as if I could will her away by sheer force of will. Then, everything went still. The room fell into an unnatural quiet, the buzz of the fluorescent lights the only sound left to ground me in reality. I opened my eyes slowly, half expecting to see her standing inches away from me, her face contorted into something inhuman. But the receptionist was back at her desk, looking down at the monitor, her posture as unbothered as if she hadn't moved at all. The other people in the waiting room seemed unchanged, as though nothing unusual had happened. I glanced at the clock. 2:40 a.m. A wave of relief washed over me, my shoulders sagging as the tension finally started to leave my body. I forced myself to my feet, my legs still shaky beneath me. I couldn't just sit there feeling like a trapped animal. I needed to move, to clear my head. As I got up to walk around the room, I remembered Rule 2. Never walk past the reception desk without greeting the receptionist after 2:30 a.m. I wasn't about to take any more chances. I turned toward the receptionist and gave her a nod, trying to keep my voice steady. Hi, I mumbled awkwardly. She didn't look up, didn't react at all, just continued to type away on the keyboard. I took that as a good sign and began walking a slow circle around the waiting room, forcing myself to stay calm, to pretend that everything was normal. The chill in the air hadn't entirely left. As I walked, I could feel a subtle shift in the temperature, a lingering cold that seemed to follow me. The overhead lights flickered faintly, casting brief shadows along the walls, giving the impression that the room was expanding and contracting with each pulse. As I rounded the corner, I felt the presence behind me, something that wasn't there before. I didn't hear footsteps, but I sensed it nonetheless, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. It was close, just out of reach. My instinct was to turn and look, to confront whatever was creeping up behind me, but I clenched my jaw and kept my gaze forward, remembering Rule 8. If you feel a sudden chill, do not look over your shoulder. I walked faster, my pulse quickening as the chill seemed to grow stronger with every step. The lights buzzed louder, the flickering more erratic. I felt something brush against the back of my neck, cold and light, like a breath. I didn't stop until I reached the chairs again, sinking into one with a shuddering breath. The presence faded, though the air remained icy, and I rubbed my hands together to warm them. I glanced back toward the reception desk, half expecting to see the receptionist watching me again, but she remained focused on her monitor, her face lit by the soft glow of the screen. I leaned back in the chair, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that the rules on that crumpled piece of paper weren't just random scribbles left behind to scare people. Whatever game I'd found myself in, it wasn't a joke. And now, the only way out seemed to be playing along. I sat there for a long moment, my body trembling, trying to calm my nerves and slow my breathing. That's when I heard the automatic doors slide open with a soft hiss. I looked up expecting to see another late-night visitor or a nurse making rounds, but my heart almost stopped when I saw who stepped inside. It was Chris. He looked perfectly fine, normal. His face had color, his clothes were clean. There wasn't a single sign that anything had been wrong with him. Relief rushed through me, and I felt the tension in my muscles finally ease. Chris's eyes found mine, and he broke into a small smile as he walked over. "Hey, Adam," he said casually, his voice the same as always. "They let me out early." The relief was so overwhelming that I laughed out loud. "Chris, man, you scared the hell out of me," I said, shaking my head. "Are you sure you're okay? You looked pretty bad earlier." He shrugged, giving a dismissive wave of his hand as he settled into the chair next to me. "Yeah, I'm fine now. Whatever it was, I guess it passed. They ran a few tests and said there was nothing serious." He flashed that familiar grin, the one I'd seen 1,000 times. Guess I'm just too stubborn to stay sick. As we talked, something in the back of my mind itched. There was an unsettling quality to the conversation, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Chris was acting normal, too normal. He was speaking in a calm, deliberate tone, his words perfectly measured. I brushed it off, figuring it was just my nerves playing tricks on me after everything that had happened tonight. Still, as Chris continued to talk, a strange sense of déjà vu settled over me. It was as if the conversation was looping back on itself, repeating the same phrases. His voice had the same rhythm, the same inflection, almost like a recording on a loop. Suddenly, I turned to see a nurse walking briskly down the hallway, pushing a gurney. My stomach dropped when I saw who was lying on it, Chris. He was unconscious, hooked up to a heart monitor, an oxygen mask over his face. My gaze darted back to the seat next to me, but the chair was empty. The Chris who had been sitting beside me was gone, vanished as though he'd never been there at all. My skin prickled as a wave of cold panic spread through me. I stared at the empty chair for a long moment, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, I saw the nurse walking by the waiting room. She glanced over at me briefly, her expression neutral. I jumped up from my chair. "Wait," I called after her. "Is Chris okay? My friend, he was just sitting here. What's going on?" The nurse slowed, turning to look at me with a small, tight-lipped smile. "Your friend is stable," she said, "but he hasn't woken up yet." Her words hung in the air, leaving me cold and confused. I glanced back at the empty seat, then at the nurse as she continued down the ER hallway. My head was spinning. Had Chris really been here, or had I just imagined him? I sank back into my chair, my body heavy with fatigue and fear. I glanced at the clock again, 3 a.m. Time was moving, but not in the way it should have. I felt trapped, as though the minutes were pulling me further into the unknown. I pulled the crumpled list of rules from my pocket and unfolded it with trembling hands, my eyes scanning the lines again, looking for answers that weren't there. I needed to understand what was happening to me, what was happening in this place. But the rules only deepened the mystery, the words twisting in my mind like a riddle I couldn't solve. Time seemed to move strangely now. I couldn't tell how long I'd been sitting in that chair, how long I'd been wandering the room. The clock above seemed to skip minutes or stall entirely, and my sense of reality continued to blur. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to me like a shroud. I glanced at the clock again. It showed 5:55 a.m. Almost there, I thought. Almost free. That was when a security guard appeared in the doorway, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the waiting room floor. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a calm, almost reassuring presence. He walked toward me with an easy stride and stopped just a few feet away. "Sir, it's time to leave," he said in a deep, measured voice. "The ER is closing for non-patient visitors." I blinked, my thoughts catching up slowly. "But my friend Chris is still..." Just then, I saw Chris walking out of the ER hallway. He waved to me, a tired but genuine smile on his face. Relief flooded through me, and I started to get up, then hesitated, the words from Rule 9 echoing in my head. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. I turned my gaze toward the clock above the reception. Desk, 6:01 a.m. My shoulders sagged in relief. I was finally free of this place. I nodded and followed the security guard toward the exit, Chris walking beside me. As we stepped out into the cool morning air, I felt like I could finally breathe again. We got into my car and I started the engine. I felt a small smile tug at my lips. I pulled out of the hospital parking lot, the tension in my chest slowly beginning to fade. But as I drove, a strange unease crept over me. The world outside the car windows seemed darker than it should have been. I glanced at the sky. It was still a deep, inky black, with no trace of the early morning light. It was too dark, too quiet. I squinted, peering between the trees lining the road, and my heart skipped a beat. In the shadows, I saw faint figures standing there, their forms barely visible, distorted as if they were made of mist. Panic surged through me. I glanced at the dashboard clock and my stomach dropped, 4:30 a.m. How was that possible? It had been well past 6 a.m. when we left the hospital. I turned to look at Chris in the passenger seat, my heart pounding in my ears. But it wasn't Chris. There was a shadow there, sitting beside me. Its form was a vague silhouette, its face obscured, but I could feel it watching me, feel its eyes boring into my skin. I gasped, my grip on the steering wheel tightening as my vision blurred with fear. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. Suddenly, I was back in the waiting room, seated in the same stiff plastic chair. The security guard stood in front of me, a grin spreading slowly across his face, his eyes unnaturally wide and gleaming in the harsh, fluorescent light. "Time to leave," he said again, his voice echoing in my head like a taunt. I felt my mind start to unravel. Had I ever left the hospital at all? Was I trapped here, destined to relive these twisted events over and over again? I buried my face in my hands, my breathing ragged as a sense of hopelessness washed over me. It felt like hours passed, but it could have been minutes or even seconds. I didn't know anymore. I was dimly aware of a nurse standing in front of me, her voice calm and soothing, pulling me back from the edge. "Sir, your friend is stable," she said gently. "He's going to be okay, but he needs rest. He'll be transferred to a hospital room soon, and you can visit him during regular visiting hours." I looked up at her, my vision clearing slowly. The waiting room was just as it had been, no sign of the security guard or anything out of the ordinary. I glanced at the clock. It read 6:30 a.m., and a soft glow of morning sunlight filtered through the glass doors, filling the room with a warm light. The nightmare was over. I nodded to the nurse, murmuring my thanks, and stumbled out of the ER, the cool morning air a welcome relief. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the hospital, half expecting to see something out of place, but it looked like any other hospital in the early light, mundane and unthreatening. I got in the car and drove home, the sun finally rising to chase away the last remnants of darkness. Later that day, I returned to the hospital to visit Chris. He was awake, sitting up in bed and looking surprisingly well for someone who had collapsed so suddenly the night before. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I pulled a chair up to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" Chris chuckled weakly. "Better than I should, I guess," he replied. "But I had the weirdest dreams last night. It was like I was half conscious the whole time." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of dreams?" Chris frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall. "One of them was, I came in the ER and saw you sitting in the waiting room. You looked pretty freaked out. And then there was another one. We were leaving the hospital together, just driving away into the night." A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, weird," I said quietly, my mind racing with the memory of the night's events. As we sat there talking, I glanced at my shoulder, where a constant pain kept tugging at me, and saw the 3 scratch marks from last night. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there in the darkness of the night I had just escaped, something was still waiting, and the rules of this place would not be so easily forgotten. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.